On a quiet Thanksgiving weekend, while neighbors slept just a few feet away, someone walked into Corey Parker's home and unleashed a level of violence detectives could barely comprehend. Over 100 stab wounds, no forced entry, no fingerprints, no sounds, not even a scream anyone remembered hearing. Whoever killed Corey didn't just want her dead. They wanted to erase every clue, every trace, every chance of knowing what truly happened in those final minutes. And for years, it worked. Her case froze. Her family waited. And the person responsible lived their life like nothing ever happened. Until one small piece of evidence, something investigators almost overlooked, finally broke the silence. Before Corey Parker became the center of one of Florida's most brutal cold cases, she was simply known as the girl who brought light into every room she walked into. Corey was 25 years old, young, ambitious, and full of restlessness that made her chase life rather than wait for it. She had recently moved to Jacksonville Beach, a calm, oceanside community where mornings smelled like salt water and nights were filled with the soft hum of beach traffic. It was the kind of place people moved to when they wanted to start fresh, and Corey was doing exactly that. She worked 2 jobs to stay afloat, juggling shifts at a local restaurant while building a small circle of friends who saw her as funny, charismatic, and always ready for a spontaneous late-night drive or beach hangout. Corey wasn't wealthy, and she wasn't someone with connections or privilege, but she was hardworking, determined, and trying her best to carve out a life that felt like her own. People who knew her said she had this natural warmth, the kind of personality that made strangers open up to her within minutes. She was observant, a little shy at first, but always kind. She loved music, loved being around people, and loved that Jacksonville Beach felt safe, safer than anywhere she'd been in years. She lived alone in a small apartment just a few blocks from the beach. It wasn't luxurious, but it was her space, her first real step toward independence. Her building was quiet, mostly young adults, mostly people who kept to themselves, the kind of place where nothing bad ever happened. But there was something else people remembered about Corey, something quiet but important. She was trusting, sometimes too trusting. She tried to see the good in people even when that instinct wasn't deserved. And in a place where everyone felt like a neighbor and a friend, that trust felt harmless. No one, not her coworkers, not her friends, not even Corey herself, imagined that someone around her, someone close enough to know her schedule, her habits, her routines, would turn her kindness into vulnerability. No one imagined that the life she worked so hard to build could be shattered so violently. And no one imagined that the person responsible would slip through the cracks so easily, leaving Corey's family in agony, detectives in confusion, and a community questioning how someone could commit such brutality and then simply disappear. Thanksgiving weekend in Jacksonville Beach was usually slow, a time when the tourists thinned out and the town felt quieter than usual. On the night Corey Parker was last seen alive, the streets were calm, the air was cool, and most people were indoors recovering from holiday gatherings. Corey wasn't the type to isolate herself. She worked hard, and when she had a free night, she let herself unwind. That evening, she had a shift at the restaurant where she worked. It wasn't a long shift, but it kept her busy, clearing tables, chatting with regulars, and doing what she always did, making people laugh even on a slow night. Coworkers later recalled that she seemed normal, maybe a little tired, but happy the holiday rush was behind them. She mentioned possibly meeting up with friends later, maybe grabbing a drink, maybe not. Nothing about her hinted at fear, stress, or the slightest intuition that something was wrong. to everyone around her, it was just another night in a small beach town. When her shift ended, Corey left the restaurant and visited a local hangout spot, a place where friends came and went, where conversations drifted lazily over music, and where the night felt safe. She talked, she laughed, she moved around the room like someone who had no enemies, no conflicts, no secret struggles. Witnesses saw her leave sometime after midnight. She wasn't intoxicated, she wasn't stumbling, she wasn't with anyone suspicious. It was a simple, ordinary decision. Go home. Call it a night. She lived only a short distance away, close enough to walk comfortably. The path she took wasn't remote or dangerous. It was familiar, a route she traveled many times. Streetlights cast long shadows across the pavement, but nothing about the walk seemed threatening. When Corey reached her apartment, everything appeared normal. No sign she'd been followed, no sign she'd invited anyone inside, no sign of a struggle at the door. Whatever happened next, whatever violence unfolded, happened inside the safety of her own home.
Detectives later believed that Corey likely knew her killer, or at the very least didn't perceive them as a threat. There were no broken locks, no forced entry, no screams that alerted neighbors in the quiet hours before dawn. She closed her front door, and for reasons she would never understand, someone else walked in after her. Someone who wanted something far darker than a conversation. Someone who turned an ordinary night into one of the most savage crime scenes Jacksonville Beach had ever seen. And by the time the sun began rising over the shoreline, the world outside continued as normal, unaware of the horror lying just behind Corey Parker's apartment door. The morning after Corey's quiet walk home, Jacksonville Beach was calm, families returning from holiday trips, neighbors stepping outside to greet the day, the ocean breeze carrying its usual softness. But inside Corey Parker's apartment, time had stopped. When Corey didn't show up for her scheduled shift, coworkers knew instantly that something was wrong. Corey wasn't unreliable. She wasn't someone who overslept or ignored responsibility. If she couldn't make it, she always called. By early afternoon, concern had turned to a knot of dread. Two friends decided to go check on her. The closer they got to her building, the heavier their steps felt. The blinds in Corey's window were still shut. The apartment was silent. They knocked. No answer. They knocked again. Still nothing. The stillness behind that door didn't feel normal. It felt wrong. And that feeling only intensified when the landlord was called to unlock the apartment. The moment the door opened, the air inside felt heavy, still, and strangely cold. It took only a few steps for them to realize this wasn't a medical emergency or a fainting incident. This was something else. Something violent. Something calculated.
Corey was found inside her bedroom, and the scene was so chaotic, so overwhelming, that even seasoned detectives would later struggle to describe it without pausing to collect themselves. What was immediately clear was that Corey had fought desperately for her life. The room told a story of sudden panic, a struggle that had no time to escape, and a level of aggression that investigators recognized instantly as overkill. Corey had been attacked with such force, such relentless intensity, that detectives knew this wasn't a random break-in or a robbery gone wrong. This was personal, violent, full of rage. But the strangest part wasn't the brutality. It was the absence. No forced entry, no broken windows, no rummaged drawers, no valuables missing, no obvious weapon left behind. The killer had come and gone without leaving a single clear clue behind, as if they'd evaporated into the air. Detectives walked through the apartment slowly, carefully, trying to understand how someone could unleash that level of violence and then slip away unseen. The walls held no fingerprints, the door showed no signs of tampering. There was nothing to indicate a stranger had forced their way in. To seasoned investigators, the message was chilling. Corey knew her killer,
or she trusted them enough not to see danger coming. Outside the apartment, the world continued normally. Neighbors enjoyed coffee, joggers passed by, cars pulled out for errands, unaware that inside that small unit, a crime so vicious had just shattered a life. And as officers zipped the scene behind yellow tape, one thing became painfully clear. Whoever killed Corey didn't just want to hurt her, they wanted to erase her and any trace that pointed back to them. But what no one realized yet was that the killer did leave something behind, something small, something invisible to the eye, something that years later would finally tell the truth. From the moment investigators stepped into Corey Parker's apartment, they knew this wasn't going to be a straightforward case. The brutality of the attack suggested deep rage, but the cleanliness of the scene suggested strategy. It was the kind of contradiction that makes detectives uneasy, because rage usually leaves chaos, mistakes, clues. But here, it left almost nothing. Detectives began to reconstruct Corey's final hours. They spoke with coworkers, friends, people who saw her the night before. Everyone said the same thing. Corey wasn't afraid, she wasn't tense, she wasn't being followed. She left work smiling, relaxed, completely unaware of what was coming. The first logical question was the one detectives always ask: who would want to hurt her? But with Corey, that question had no easy answer. She didn't have enemies, she wasn't involved in drugs, she wasn't in debt, she wasn't part of any dangerous crowd. She was just a young woman trying to start her life. Detectives canvassed the apartment complex, going door to door. Neighbors recalled nothing. No shouting, no banging, no suspicious movement. Not even a dog barking at an unfamiliar presence. The silence around Corey's apartment that night felt impossible, almost unnatural. Theory number 1, a random intruder. Detectives quickly ruled this out. There was no forced entry, nothing stolen, and no sign someone had broken in from a window or patio. Whoever entered that apartment either had a key, was let in, or slipped through a moment of opportunity. Theory number 2, someone Corey knew. This theory immediately felt stronger. The attack was personal, emotional. The killer didn't hesitate, they didn't panic. They walked into Corey's home with purpose, which meant they likely understood her routine and her trust patterns. Detectives began quietly interviewing people in Corey's orbit. Coworkers, neighbors, acquaintances, anyone who had been near her that evening. Some people stood out briefly: a friend who had argued with Corey weeks earlier, an ex-coworker with a temper, a neighbor whose story felt rehearsed, but none of these leads held. And then came the first strange detail. Corey's apartment door had no signs of damage, but the lock itself had an odd scuff on the inside. Not quite forced, not quite clean, a mark that suggested the door had been shut quickly or by someone who entered without the hesitation of a stranger. Even more unsettling, detectives believed Corey was attacked while either asleep or caught off guard. And the way the assault unfolded suggested the killer had moved through the small space like they were familiar with it. But just when detectives thought they had momentum, the case hit its first brick wall. There were no usable fingerprints, no shoe prints, no weapon, no eyewitnesses, no surveillance footage, and nothing obvious to tie any suspect to the crime. As days stretched into weeks and the investigation grew wider, one thing became painfully clear. The killer had vanished into the normal rhythm of the town, blending in, walking unnoticed among the very people searching for him. And without forensic evidence to break the silence, Corey's case began to cool. Not because detectives stopped caring, but because the evidence simply wasn't there. But hidden deep within the chaos of that brutal crime scene, something was left behind. Something too small to matter at the time. Something that would become the key to everything years later when the case was pulled out of storage and given a second look. In the weeks after Corey Parker's murder, investigators worked around the clock. They re-interviewed neighbors, checked every incoming tip, re-examined the crime scene photographs, and revisited every theory. But the deeper they dug, the more the case seemed to resist clarity. And then the momentum simply stopped. Leads dried up, Suspects were cleared. Forensic tests returned inconclusive. Witnesses who once seemed promising turned out to have airtight alibis. It wasn't that detectives lacked effort, it was that they lacked something to hold on to. Corey's killer hadn't left a trail, he had erased it. Detectives described the case as one of the most haunting they had handled. The brutality, the silence, the complete absence of motive. Many of them later said that Corey's apartment felt too staged, like the killer had taken their time and taken precautions that were uncommon for someone committing such an emotional, rage-filled crime. But without evidence, suspicion meant nothing. Back in Texas, Corey's family watched the investigation stall with sinking horror. They were told the same words no family ever wants to hear. "We're doing everything we can. We just need that one piece of evidence." Sometimes these cases take years. Years! Corey's mother said she used to wake up every morning thinking that day would bring a breakthrough, and went to bed every night feeling the same crushing disappointment. Their daughter had been murdered in her own home, and there was no one to blame. What kept investigators awake at night was how unusual Corey's murder truly was. Extremely violent, but cleanly executed. No theft, no forced entry, no sexual assault. No signs of a fight loud enough to alert neighbors. No prolonged fight visible through defensive wounds. It was a contradiction they couldn't solve. A murder this personal should have created mistakes, but the mistakes weren't visible yet. Eventually, the detective assigned to the case was forced to admit the case had reached a standstill. Internal deadlines passed, overtime hours dried up, leads went stale, and just like that, Corey's case shifted from active investigation to pending review, then to the quiet drawer all detectives dread: unsolved file. Years turned into years. Corey's apartment was cleaned, repainted, and rented to new tenants. Life in Jacksonville Beach moved on. The community stopped whispering about the killer living among them. Even the crime scene photos faded slightly with age in their evidence sleeves. But deep inside the police evidence room, sealed inside a small packet marked with Corey's case number, was a microscopic fragment the killer unintentionally left behind. A fragment no one realized mattered. A fragment that technology in the early 2000s couldn't yet understand. It would take nearly 5 years, a change in forensic science, and a reassessment by a new investigator, before that tiny, nearly invisible clue would finally speak. And when it did, it pointed to someone no one had suspected, someone who had been close the entire time. For nearly 5 years, Corey Parker's murder sat buried within the cold case files at the Jacksonville Beach Police Department, a box of photographs, reports, and evidence that held more questions than answers. Her family waited, her friends mourned, and the city slowly moved on. But the case never stopped haunting investigators.
Everything changed when the department initiated a fresh, technology-driven review of older unsolved homicides. Corey's file was among the first pulled from storage. Inside that worn case folder were the same images that had once stunned detectives: the brutality of the attack, the lack of forced entry, the eerie quiet of the night she was killed. But now, with years of scientific advancement behind them, the cold case team approached the evidence with new eyes. And that's when they noticed something others had once dismissed: a microscopic fragment of DNA collected from the bedding beside Corey's body. Back in 1998, it was too small, too degraded, too unstable to make sense of. Technology simply wasn't strong enough to analyze it. But in the early 2000s, forensic DNA testing had evolved into something far more precise, powerful enough to pull genetic profiles from the smallest trace. The team ordered the sample to be retested. Days later, the lab called back with a result no one expected: a clear, partial male DNA profile. And it wasn't Corey's. This wasn't contamination. This wasn't incidental contact. This was the killer's biological signature, left behind in a moment of violence he thought no one would ever trace. For the first time since Corey was murdered, investigators had something real, something solid, something that could breathe life back into a case frozen by time. The cold case team began collecting voluntary DNA swabs from people who lived near Corey, worked with her, or were connected to her in even the smallest way. One after another, they were ruled out. No matches. But someone was missing from those early investigations. A young man who had lived only steps from Corey's apartment, someone considered irrelevant at the time because he seemed quiet, socially uncomfortable, and forgettable. He had been overlooked, and for years he lived with the comfort of believing he always would be. But when the cold case team finally reached out and requested his DNA, everything changed. He hesitated, not dramatically, just enough for investigators to notice. Eventually he agreed and handed over the swab. When the lab processed his DNA, the results were undeniable. It matched the DNA found at Corey's crime scene, perfectly, unquestionably, irrefutably. For nearly 5 years, Corey's killer had lived his life normally, walking past the apartment where he murdered her, blending into the community, building relationships, and pretending to be harmless. But the science he never counted on had finally caught up to him. And with that match, Corey Parker's case was no longer a mystery. It was solvable. And justice, the justice she had been denied for years, was suddenly within reach. When detectives finally unraveled the truth, the name attached to the brutality was Stephen Smith, a man who had lived only a few doors away from Corey, blending into the background like any quiet neighbor would. But beneath that quietness, there was rot. Smith was an ordinary-looking young man living near Corey. People described him as quiet, socially uncomfortable, and somewhat aloof. He wasn't known for violence. He wasn't on any police radar. But beneath that quiet surface, there were troubling patterns. Smith had watched Corey for months, not casually, not accidentally. He stalked her. Neighbors later told investigators that Smith would often watch Corey come and go, sometimes stepping outside when she arrived home, or positioning himself to get a clearer view of her movements. Digital forensics and interview timelines confirmed what detectives suspected. Smith had developed an unhealthy fixation on her. When the case went cold, the Jacksonville Beach Police Department reopened it, launching a full forensic re-examination. It was during this renewed effort that detectives obtained DNA from residents who lived near Corey at the time of the murder. Smith gave his sample, believing he would outsmart them. He attempted to provide a sample he thought was clean, scraping the inside of his cheek before the swab, trying to remove loose skin and saliva. But DNA can't lie. The sample still matched the genetic material found at Corey's crime scene. That was the moment the investigation shifted. The quiet neighbor was no longer just a name. He was their suspect. When detectives confronted Stephen Smith about the DNA evidence, the facade he had maintained began to crumble. But even then, he never gave a full confession. He didn't offer a motive. He didn't explain why he spent so much time watching Corey. He didn't justify the brutality of the attack. He denied, deflected, and avoided. His calm turned to agitation, then to silence. The only admission he ever made was in action, not words. He tried to flee the state. Before police could arrest him in person, they tracked him to Ohio, living with relatives, preparing to disappear completely. That attempt to escape sealed his fate. Combined with the DNA evidence, it was enough to get the arrest warrant and secure his conviction. To this day, Stephen Charles Smith has never explained why he murdered Corey Parker. Not once. Not even after being sentenced to life in prison without parole.
When Corey Parker's killer was finally sentenced, a quiet shift moved through Jacksonville Beach. For years, her apartment had been a reminder of fear, a place where neighbors checked their locks twice, where young women hesitated before living alone, where silence felt threatening.
But with the conviction came something the community hadn't felt since 1998. Relief. Not because the pain disappeared, but because they finally knew the truth. They finally had a name. And the man who had walked among them, unnoticed, was now exactly where he belonged. Corey's family spoke of her not as a victim, but as a radiant young woman whose life was filled with warmth. She had been someone who lit up every room she entered, someone who chose kindness without thinking, someone who deserved decades more than the 25 short years she was given. Friends described her laugh, her drive, her talent behind the bar, how she moved through life with a kind of effortless confidence. Her story had become more than the brutality of her final moments. It became a reminder of how fragile life is and how deeply one person can be missed. Even after Corey's killer was identified and convicted, one haunting question still lingers. Why? Why would a man with no documented history of violent crime suddenly erupt with such extreme, overwhelming brutality? Why target Corey, a woman he barely knew? Why return to his daily life afterward as if nothing had happened? And perhaps the most chilling question of all, what happened inside that apartment in the final minutes before the attack? Investigators solved the who, but the why remains a void, one her family may never fully understand. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. What do you believe triggered the violence that night? Was it opportunity? Rage? A hidden impulse waiting for the smallest opening? Your perspective might help shed light on a case that, even solved, still holds shadows no one has been able to explain.